In the year 711 AD, Spain was ruled by a tyrant Christian ruler, King Roderick of Visigoth. One of King Roderick's oppressed chief, Julian of Ceuta, went to North Africa to meet Musa ibn Nusayr, with a plea for help against the tyrannical Visigoth ruler of Spain, King Roderick. Musa ibn Nusayr was an Arab general and governor who served under the Umayyad Caliph Al-Walid I, and he ruled over the Muslim provinces of North Africa. Julian complained to Musa about the lust, the greed and the tyranny of King Roderick. Musa felt sympathy for the oppressed Spaniards and agreed to help Julian with his plight. Musa ibn Nusayr then commanded his renowned general, Tariq ibn Ziyad, to lead a mission to conquer Spain and restore order there. An army of 10,000 men was swiftly assembled under the young general Tariq's leadership, and they set sail for Spain. The general and his army soon reached land and anchored at a place around the Spanish coastal areas, which later came to be known after his name as Jabal al-Tariq, which is presently called Gibraltar. And after landing in Gibraltar, General Tariq ordered his army to burn all the ships, so that none of his men may not think of returning or retreating, as there is only conquer or be conquered, victory or defeat. Anything less is to be forgotten to history. The news of the invasion quickly reached King Roderick, who promptly gathered his army and headed straight to the battlefield. Seated majestically on his splendid throne, King Roderick arrived on the battlefield with an air of grandeur and spectacle. His troops were wearing brand new, glittering uniforms. They were all very well equipped with all sorts of arms and ammunition. But due to General Tariq's dare and determination, the Muslim forces defeated the far bigger and more well-equipped army of Roderick, which consisted of more than 100,000 troops. The Muslim army defeated the Visigoth army easily. Immediately after this defeat, King Roderick fled the battlefield, but the Muslim army pursued and eventually caught up to him, and King Roderick was killed. After that, the Muslim forces swiftly conquered much of the Iberian Peninsula and then conquered most of Spain and Portugal with little difficulty and with little opposition. And by the year 720, Spain was predominantly under Muslim or Moorish control, marking the beginning of the Muslim era in Spain, known as Al-Andalus. After the death of King Roderick and the conquering of Spain by the Moors, the Muslim era Al-Andalus in Spain began. Abd al-Aziz, the son of Musa ibn Nusayr of North Africa and the conqueror of Spain, was appointed the first Amir of Spain, and he established the Umayyad rule in Spain, which started in the year 714 until 756 AD. Abd al-Aziz married the widow of Emperor Frederick, who became a tool for creating discord among the Muslims, advancing her own influence. This fueled tensions between Arabs and Berbers, sparked clashes between Syrian and Madinite tribes, and deepened conflicts between Shias and Sunnis. The growing inner divisions and dissensions eventually assumed such a serious magnitude that keeping a solid and united Muslim rule in Spain became impossible. It was at this critical juncture that the Umayyad prince Abd al-Rahman managed to sneak into Spain. That is why he is known as al-Dakhil, the entrant, because he entered into Spain and established his rule over there. Abd al-Rahman al-Dakhil then defeated the tottering Syrian government in Spain with the help of a handful of Berber troops, and by the 10th Dhu al-Hajj in year 756, he had captured the whole of Spain. With that, the first Umayyad phase of confusion and chaos came to a permanent end. Despite all the dissension and disorder during this first Umayyad phase, the Muslim Mujahids kept on launching raids on southern France from Spain. They even captured quite a number of the French areas. However, after a great deal of alternating advances and reversals, the Muslim armies had to quit France ultimately. Following the conclusion of the first Umayyad phase, stability in Muslim Spain was restored with the establishment of the Andalusian Umayyad dynasty by Abd al-Rahman al-Dakhil in the year 756 AD, where he ruled for about 33 years. He laid solid foundations of a sovereign and progressive Umayyad government. Abd al-Rahman al-Dakhil overpowered intrigues and insurgencies very wisely. He displayed statesmanship of a high caliber in administering the Muslim state. He reorganized the system of law and justice. He was extremely fond of knowledge and learning. He invited celebrated scholars from all over the world and organized specialized debates and discussions. He took keen interest in constructing magnificent mosques and beautiful buildings. Córdoba, the capital of the Muslim Spain, was turned into an extremely pretty metropolis. Construction of the historic mosque at Córdoba was also started during the reign of Abd al-Rahman al-Dakhil. On his death, his son Hisham ibn Abd al-Rahman succeeded him as the Amir of Spain in the year 788. Southern France was invaded and captured again during the reign of Hisham ibn Abd al-Rahman, and Arabic was enforced and made compulsory in conquered territory. This opened up new visions and vistas in their thought and behavior. The resultant mental, cultural, and professional changes then served as solid base for the Renaissance movement to spread in the whole of Europe. Amir Abd al-Rahman, who founded the Emirate of Córdoba, was able to get the various different Muslim groups who had conquered Spain to pull together in ruling it. This Muslim period in Spain is often described as a golden era of learning, where libraries, colleges, public baths were established, and literature, poetry, and architecture flourished. There were religious and ethnic tolerance and interfaith harmony between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Non-Muslims were not forced to live in ghettos or segregated areas, nor were they enslaved. They were allowed to practice their faith. They were not forced to convert under threat of death, and they were not barred from many professions. They also took jobs that were avoided by Muslims, such as tanning and butchery, as well as more desirable roles like banking and dealing in gold and silver. They could also work within the civil service of the Islamic rulers, contributing to society and culture. Hakam I succeeded Hisham ibn Abd al-Rahman as Amir. As he conquered several other areas in France, Hakam came to be known as the Conqueror. After him, many others came to rule one after the other, till the famed Abd al-Rahman III became the ruler in 912 AD. He consolidated Muslim rule further. Mutayyan Billah was the last Umayyad ruler of Spain. After him, the government got transferred to Muhammad ibn Amr Mansur, the founder of the Amr dynasty. Like Hakam ibn Abd al-Rahman III, Muhammad ibn Amr Mansur was a great ruler in the history of Spain. He ruled for 27 years and led such a large number of fruitful jihads that he came to be known as the Victorious. After a few of his successors, the rule of the Amr dynasty came to a close in Spain in the year 1036 AD. That year also marks the end of the golden era of Muslim power and progress in Spain. Muhammad ibn Amr Mansur, al-Mansur, born in the year 938 AD, quickly proved an able civil servant and maneuvered into increasingly important positions, and eventually securing the position of Hajib and ruling in the name of a weak caliph, Hisham II, whom he controlled. Al-Mansur plotted and killed his rivals to gain power, supposedly scheming with Hisham's mother Subh, a Basque slave girl who had become a royal wife. Most of Hisham's ancestors were of Spanish descent, who were originally non-Muslim and often blonde slave girls or concubines. Hisham's grandfather, the first Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Rahman III, dyed his blonde beard black to make him look less like the Christians of the north, whose descendant he was, on his mother's and grandmother's side. For 24 years, Al-Mansur would wield supreme power in Al-Andalus, in a regime whose leadership was composed of Umayyad Arab nobility, with an army made up increasingly of imported Berber tribesmen and Slavic slave soldiers. Al-Mansur burnished his credentials through war. There were over 56 military campaigns that was led by Al-Mansur in person during his reign. Most of them were raids, waged against the warring and divided Christian kingdoms and principalities of the northern Iberian Peninsula: Leon, Castile, Navarre, Pamplona, and Catalonia. Al-Mansur's motivations were multifaceted. Jihad against the infidel was a source of political and religious legitimacy. It is said that he never went into battle without the Quran he had transcribed by his own hand with him. There was also considerable loot and wealth to be acquired and distributed. Al-Mansur also warred against Muslims, including his own rebellious son Abdullah, who he put to death after forcing the Christian ruler who had given Abdullah refuge to surrender him. During this period, Jews and Christians in Muslim Spain faced considerable restrictions, living under a system known as dimitude, where their freedoms were constrained despite the overall atmosphere of relative tolerance. Persecutions and executions occurred during this period. Christians were subject to various restrictions. They were not allowed to have houses taller than those of Muslims. They could not employ Muslim servants, and they had to give way to Muslims in the streets. They were also forbidden from displaying any symbols of their faith, including carrying a Bible in public. With the over 56 raids led by Al-Mansur, he brought back wealth in the form of gold and silver, silk and brocade, looted marble, but especially many slaves. Al-Mansur's army traveled with cavalry, consisting of 4,000 transport camels and 6 catapults. They also traveled with manacles for the many captives taken. Some nobility and persons of note were taken to be held for ransom, but most of his captives were sabaya, women and girls. About 300,000 slaves were taken by Al-Mansur in all of his conquest and raids around medieval Europe at that time. Although 10th century Umayyad Cordoba was an important slave power, slavery existed throughout the medieval world, in Muslim, Christian, and pagan-ruled states. But the slave trade was a major source of wealth in Islamic Spain. In Cordoba, there were slaves taken in Africa, and also Slavic slaves trafficked by Jewish merchants across Christian Europe from what is now Ukraine. Under Al-Mansur, the principal source of slaves, especially slave girls, was from the Christian kingdoms of northern Spain. The flood of Christian slave girls had an unexpected but unsurprising knock-on effect on Muslim family life in Al-Mansur's Al-Andalus. Men stopped marrying free Muslim women and preferred to purchase an inexpensive Christian captive as a concubine. A beautiful slave girl from a noble Christian family, who used to cost 50 or 60 dinars, now sold for only 20 dinars. If the captive was pleasing, she could be freed and married. Muslim families facing such competition had to offer richer dowries, even real estate, to secure suitable husbands for their daughters. The superabundance of slaves in Cordoba also fueled a trade extending to other parts of the Muslim world. After 2 decades of victories, an aging and gouty Al-Mansur could barely defeat a united Christian army at Cervera in 1000 AD. Some of the Christian nobles opposing him there had once been his allies. Al-Mansur died 2 years later, in the year 1002. One of the most notorious incidents was a pogrom in Granada in the year 1066, which was followed by further violence and discrimination as the Islamic Empire experienced increasing pressure. As the Islamic Empire declined and Christian forces reclaimed more territories, Muslims living under Christian rule began to face similar restrictions to those they had once imposed on non-Muslims. However, in general, the conditions for minority religious groups worsened after Islam was replaced by Christianity in Spain. The fall of Islamic rule in Spain was due not only to the growing aggression of Christian states, but also to internal divisions among Muslim rulers. Problems emerged both from the core of the empire and its fringes. By the early 11th century, the unified Islamic Caliphate had fragmented into multiple small kingdoms, leaving them vulnerable to Christian conquest. The first major Islamic center to fall was Toledo in the year 1085. In response, Muslim forces from North Africa, led by General Yusuf bin Tashfin, decisively defeated the Christians in the year 1086. By 1102 AD, they had reclaimed much of Andalusia, temporarily reuniting Muslim Spain under Yusuf's leadership. However, this unity was short-lived. Yusuf died in 1106, and the Muslim rulers soon turned on each other. Internal rebellions in the year 1144 and 1145 further fractured Islamic unity. Despite occasional military victories, Muslim domination in Spain came to an end. The final blow came in the year 1492, when the Muslims lost all power in Spain. By the year 1502, the Christian rulers issued an edict requiring all Muslims to convert to Christianity, and when this failed, they imposed harsh restrictions on the remaining Muslims in Spain. Until the mid-15th century, Europe enjoyed a safe land passage to China and India, sources of valued goods such as silk, spices and opiates, under the hegemony of the Mongol Empire. But with the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans, European countries sought to compete with the Silk Road, dominated by the gunpowder empires, through expanded use of ocean voyages to scope out and establish new trade routes. The Mediterranean Sea, along with Rome, Constantinople and Alexandria, marked the core, and to some extent, the horizon of the Christian Church. In the year 1453, this perspective suddenly changed. An incredulous Christian world heard that the Muslims had taken Constantinople and that the Hagia Sophia had been converted into a mosque. No nations were more deeply shaken by this news than Portugal and Spain, who themselves had only recently been freed from Muslim control. They therefore became all the more involved when the Pope called for a new crusade against the enemies of Christianity. At this time, the small Portuguese nation, with a population of just 2 million, sought a solution and found it in Prince Henry the Navigator, the son of King João I. He possessed the vision and determination to discover new sea routes for trade and to explore lands that were not yet under Muslim control. Before Christopher Columbus sailed westward to the Americas, Portuguese ships, often with Genoese sailors, ventured south to Ceuta and to the Canary and Cape Verde Islands. In Ceuta, the Portuguese encountered Arab merchants who were familiar with the slave and gold trade routes that connected West Africa to the Mediterranean, passing through the Western Sahara Desert under the control of the Moors of North Africa. The sailors had already met Africans in Portugal, and black slaves were first acquired from Northern Africa as early as the 1300s. The young Prince Henry the Navigator was there and became aware of profit possibilities in the trans-Saharan trade routes. Henry wished to know how far Muslim territories in Africa extended, hoping to bypass them and trade directly with West Africa by sea. Find allies in legendary Christian lands to the south, like the supposed long-lost Christian kingdom of Prester John, and probe whether it was possible to reach the Indies by sea, the source of the lucrative spice trade. He invested in sponsoring voyages down the coast of Mauritania, gathering a group of merchants, ship owners and stakeholders interested in new sea lanes. Soon, the Atlantic islands of Madeira and the Azores were reached. Gone were the times of using the manpower of oarsmen. Technical advances in ship design were experimented with and worked. Sails, stern post, and the magnetic compass were the answer, and ever more sophisticated shapes and sizes of sails related to longer and finer forms of caravels and galleons. The magnetic compass, first used in China during the Han Dynasty, was first adopted by Arab traders in the Indian Ocean. The compass later spread to Europe by the late 12th or early 13th century. With the potential possibilities of the improved sailing ship, there were seemingly no limits to what could be attempted and achieved via the seas. Europeans did not know what lay beyond Cape Non on the African coast, and whether it was possible to return once it was crossed. Nautical myths spoke of sea monsters and the edge of the world, but Henry the Navigator defied these superstitions. Beginning in 1421, his expeditions systematically pushed past such fears, eventually reaching the challenging Cape Bojador. From 1440 onwards, caravels were extensively used for the exploration of the coast of Africa. This was an existing Iberian ship type, used for fishing, commerce, and military purposes. Unlike other vessels of the time, the caravel had a stern-post-mounted rudder, as opposed to a side-mounted steering oar. It had a shallow draft, which was helpful in exploring unknown coastlines. With sail-equipped caravels reaching the Upper and Lower Guinea coasts, the offshore islands of Cape Verde and São Tomé became key embarkation ports. The annual import of slaves to Portugal steadily increased. From 1490 to 1530, between 300 and 2,000 slaves were brought annually to Lisbon. The slaves supplied prestige and profit, and were employed in cities, in agriculture, in royal palaces, and on the ships. By the king's order, slaves were to be baptized and given Christian burial. Conversion to Christianity was seen as a key to social acceptance and advance. The slaves could also join one of the numerous religious fraternities associated with the convents of the Dominicans and Capuchins. At religious festivals, they sometimes attended as bands, dancing, singing, and playing. Prince Henry prepared new generations of daring seamen to venture beyond the fearful capes along northwest Africa. After his death in 1460, others followed his example. Like Bartolomeus Diaz, who went beyond the Guineas and rounded the Cape of Good Hope. The ruthless Vasco da Gama, who went beyond the Cape and along the east coast of Africa to Mombasa in 1497 to 98. From there, he followed the monsoon until he reached Calicut on the west coast of India. Spain sponsored Christopher Columbus's voyages from 1492 to 1504, beginning the colonization of the Americas, and Ferdinand Magellan's expedition from 1519 to 1522 achieved the first circumnavigation of the globe. These expeditions led to the Columbian Exchange, transferring plants, animals, people, including many slaves, diseases, and culture between the old and new worlds. European exploration, led by Spain and Portugal, opened new trade routes and reshaped global history through conquest and exploitation, connecting previously isolated regions and paving the way for globalization. Soon after, powers like England, France, and the Netherlands joined in, further expanding international trade. Exploration fostered the growth of colonial empires and marked the rise of colonialism as state policy. Power dynamics shifted as Europe extended its influence globally, shaping the modern world. Christopher Columbus was born in 1451 in Genoa, Italy, and there his boyhood was spent. As a child, he loved to watch the sailors haul up the anchor and let loose the sails when a ship began her voyage. His youthful pastime was to learn the names of the ropes and find out what each was for. His father sent him to the University of Pavia, and there he learned about the stars that guide the seaman on his way. He also learned to draw maps and charts. While drawing those maps, he used to wonder whether there was not some land beyond the Canaries and the Azores. At 15, he became a sailor. He went on voyages to England and Ireland, Iceland, to Greece and elsewhere. He lived a while in Portugal, and there married the daughter of a sea captain, who was the governor of Porto Santo, one of the Madeira Islands. From boyhood, he had been possessed with the idea that the earth is round. He believed that the piece of carved wood picked up 400 miles at sea, and the bodies of two men unlike any other human beings known, found on the shores of Portugal, had drifted from unknown lands in the west. Columbus, a self-taught philosopher, ascertained just how long it took the sun to traverse the 2,000 miles length of the Mediterranean Sea. From that, he inferred the distance of space over which it would pass in 24 hours. Gradually, Columbus came to the conclusion that the world must be a globe, and that by sailing directly west, the shores of Asia would eventually be reached. By his measurement of the sun's apparent speed, he had formed a pretty accurate estimate of the size of the globe. It was not his belief that there was any land between Europe and Asia on the west, but he expected that one would reach the coast of Asia, about where he subsequently found the shores of the New World. Many years after Columbus had returned to Spain, The Council of Wise Men, called by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, ridiculed his theory of reaching the east by sailing west. The threadbare adventurer was anything but imposing. He was poor and shabbily dressed, but the splendors of royalty could not overawe him at this time. "But the sun and moon are round," said Columbus. "Why not the earth?" "If the earth is a ball, what holds it up?" asked the wise men. "What holds the sun and moon up?" inquired Columbus. "But how can men walk with their heads hanging down and their feet up, like flies on a ceiling?" asked a learned doctor. "How can trees grow with their roots in the air?" "The water would run out of the ponds and we should fall off," said another philosopher. "This doctrine is contrary to the Bible, which says, 'The heavens are stretched out like a tent.'" "Of course it is flat. It is rank heresy to say it is round," said a priest. The views of Columbus were denounced, not only as unphilosophical, but also as unscriptural, by the Council of Wise Men. This denunciation was made by one of the most learned bodies at that time. Columbus left in despair and decided to try his fortune at the court of France. On his way to the French capital, Columbus stopped by the convent where he had first left his son Diego 7 years previously, after the death of his wife. The prior of the convent had become fully convinced that the views of Columbus were rational and that Spain should not give up the opportunity which now Columbus was about to grant the court of France. The prior had, in former years, been chaplain of Queen Isabella, so he persuaded Columbus to stay on and let him write the Queen an urgent letter which was promptly dispatched. In the letter, the prior told Isabella that it would add great renown to her reign at a trifling expense, if what the sailor believed should prove true. "It shall be done," said Isabella. "I will pledge my jewels to raise the money. Call him back." Columbus turned, and with him turned the world. But not a sailor would go voluntarily. So Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand compelled them. Christopher Columbus and his sailors then set sail out for the New World. 3 days out in his vessels, scarcely larger than fishing schooners, the Pinta floated a distress signal for a broken rudder. Terror seized the sailors, but Columbus calmed their fears with pictures of gold and precious stones from India. 200 miles west of the Canaries, the compass ceased to point to the North Star. The sailors are ready to mutiny, but he tells them the North Star is not exactly north. 2,300 miles from home, a bush with berries floats by, land birds fly near, and they pick up a piece of wood curiously carved. On October 12th, 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the Americas, and Columbus raised the banner of Castile, Spain, over the Western world. From the mid-7th century to the 20th century, Arab traders primarily transported enslaved people across the Sahara, with most of the slaves being taken from Sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa to be sold to the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern civilizations. It is estimated that between 6 and 10 million black slaves were taken from Sub-Saharan Africa to the Arab world, with about 7 million slaves crossing the Sahara, and the rest slaves moved in the opposite direction. The trans-Saharan slave trade was managed by Arabs with the active involvement from Berbers. During this period, black Africans, Turks, Iranians, Europeans and Berbers were also traded throughout the Arab world, and particularly in Western Asia, North Africa, East Africa, and parts of Europe. After the 8th century Arab conquest of North Africa, Arabs and Berbers ventured into Sub-Saharan Africa, pursuing the trans-Saharan trade, particularly in slaves, as there was constant demand for enslaved labor in Eastern Arab nations and Constantinople. Slaves were often captured through violent raids and forced on perilous marches across the Sahara to be sold in slave markets, where they were treated as chattel, personal property to be bought and sold. In North Africa, the main slave markets were in Morocco, Algiers, Tripoli and Cairo, and sales were held in public places such as souks. Aside from raiding, slaves could also be obtained by purchasing them from local black rulers. Few African rulers would resist the slave trade, while many chiefs would become middlemen in the trafficking, rounding up members of nearby villages to be sold to visiting merchants. Some black Africans also participated in slave raiding. Kingdoms looking to expand their territories would often invade their neighbors, take them as slaves, and carry them off to their own lands to sell them by the dozens to the merchants. Every year, great numbers of them were sent off to the Western Maghreb. Muslim merchants also employed various tactics to capture and enslave black people, with some merchants reportedly luring Zanj children using dates, enticing them from place to place until they were captured, taken out of their homeland, and transported to foreign lands. Muslim traders often referred to the African populations they enslaved as Zanj or Sudan, meaning black. The routes taken by slave caravans varied based on their destination. Slaves bound for Egypt were transported by boat along the Nile, while those heading to Arabia were sent to Red Sea ports like Suakin and Assab. Slaves destined for North Africa traveled via the ancient Saharan trade routes, in use since around 1000 BC, such as the Tripoli-Ghadames-Gat-Hoga-Gao route that linked modern Libya to Nigeria, or the Tripoli-Fezzan-Bornu route that connected Libya to present-day Chad, Niger, and Cameroon. There were also other key routes that connected Egypt to Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. The Kanem-Bornu-Zawila route was vital for North African trade, with the Kanem-Bornu Empire playing a significant role in the trans-Saharan slave trade, which contributed to its wealth. Passage through the Sahara required the expertise of ethnic groups whose lifestyles were uniquely adapted for survival in scorching, arid environments, namely the local Berber tribes and the foreign Bedouins from Arabia. Oases were vital way stations for caravans. The Tuareg and others who were indigenous to Libya facilitated, taxed, and partly organized the trade from the south along the trans-Saharan trade routes. Various nomadic peoples played critical roles as guards, guides, and camel drivers. As a result, they were granted autonomy and treated as allies by governments of North Africa. Despite this expertise, the journey across the desert was perilous, and entire caravans could vanish. The trans-Saharan trade involved the exchange of goods like food and clothing coming into Africa, while slaves, gold, and coconuts were exported. In the 16th century, Moroccan traders brought horses, European cloth, sugar, books, and brass vessels to Sudan in exchange for slaves, civet cats, and gold. The Sultan of Bornu, however, only accepted horses in exchange for slaves with rates as high as 1 slave per 20 horses. Slaves were assigned various tasks, including servile labor in irrigation, pastoralism, mining, transport, public works, proto-industry, and construction. Most black slaves were used as laborers, servants, or eunuchs, and in military roles. Female slaves were generally employed in domestic work and concubinage, while eunuchs, valued at 7 times the price of non-castrated males, served as harem guards, administrators, tutors, secretaries, commercial agents, and even concubines. Due to Islamic restrictions on castration, slaves were often castrated before being transported across the Sahara or after purchase in North African markets. Conditions for slaves in mining, particularly in Basra's salt mines, were notoriously harsh, leading to the Zanj rebellion. Both male and female slaves were also used in Egypt's copper mines, and the Carmatian Republic of Eastern Arabia reportedly employed 30,000 black slaves for labor. In medieval Muslim culture, blackness became increasingly associated with slavery, a belief often justified by a specific interpretation of the biblical story of the curse of Ham. This interpretation suggested that Ham's descendants were cursed with black skin and destined for slavery. Muslim slave traders used this rationale to justify the enslavement of black people, including black Muslims. In the late 14th century, a black king of Bornu, wrote to the Sultan of Egypt, protesting against the frequent slave raids by Arab tribesmen that were devastating his lands and enslaving his Muslim population. In Al-Andalus, black Muslims could legally be held as slaves despite Islamic law forbidding the enslavement of any Muslim, regardless of race. Even into the 19th century, many in Islamic societies believed that enslavement based on skin color, rather than religion, was supported by religious laws. By the late 16th century, due to instability caused by Moroccan invasions of the Songhai Empire, former slave routes had shifted, replacing the Songhai route with new ones like the Benghazi Wadai route through Sudan. After Europeans settled in the Gulf of Guinea, the Arab trans-Saharan slave trade declined in importance. Slavery was a part of the economic structure of African societies for many centuries, although the extent varied. Systems of servitude and slavery were once commonplace in parts of Africa, as they were in much of the rest of the ancient and medieval world. Slavery in historical Africa was practiced in many different forms. Chattel slavery, a form of servitude where slaves are treated as the personal property of their owner, who is free to sell, trade, or exploit them like any other possession. The children of the slaves, who were often born into slavery, remained the property of the master. Debt bondage was another form of servitude, where individuals were pledged as collateral for loans. In West Africa, this system allowed debtors or their relatives, often children, to work off a debt. While related to slavery, pawnship or debt bondage typically included limited terms of service and protection through family ties, preventing the person from being sold into slavery. This practice was common among the Akan, Ewe, Ga, Yoruba, and Edo peoples of West Africa. Military slavery involved conscripting and training slaves as soldiers, where the slave soldiers were managed by a patron, who could be a ruler or warlord, using them for his financial and political gain. Slavery for domestic and court purposes was widespread throughout Africa. Plantation slavery also occurred, primarily on the eastern coast of Africa and in parts of West Africa. The importance of domestic plantation slavery increased during the 19th century due to the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. Human sacrifices, particularly of slaves, was also prevalent in West Africa, especially in the 18th and 19th century. The most infamous example was the annual customs of Dahomey, where 500 slaves were sacrificed. Human sacrifices also occurred along the West African coast and in the Benin Empire, as well as in small states in what is now southern Nigeria. In Sub-Saharan Africa, the slave relationships were often complex, with rights and freedoms given to individuals held in slavery and restrictions on sale and treatment by their masters. Many communities had hierarchies between different types of slaves. For example, differentiating between those who had been born into slavery and those who had been captured through war. The forms of slavery in Africa were closely related to kinship structures. In many African communities, where land could not be owned, enslavement of individuals was used as a means to increase the influence a person had and expand connections. This made slaves a permanent part of a master's lineage, and the children of slaves could become closely connected with the larger family ties. Children of slaves born into families could be integrated into the master's kinship group and rise to prominent positions within society, even to the level of chief in some instances. However, stigma often remained attached, and there could be strict separations between slave members of a kinship group and those related to the master. In Africa, many slaves were involved in domestic slavery, working in the master's household while enjoying certain freedoms. Domestic slaves were considered part of the household and were rarely sold. They could earn profits from their labor, own land, marry, and pass assets to their children. In East Africa, the Christian kings of the Ethiopian Empire captured slaves primarily from the pagan Nilotic Shankela and Oromo peoples from their western borderlands. or from newly conquered or reconquered lowland territories. The Somali and Afar Muslim sultanates, such as the medieval Adal Sultanate, through their ports, also traded Zanj Bantu slaves captured from the hinterland. Slavery, as practiced in Ethiopia, was essentially domestic and was geared more towards women. This was the trend for most of Africa as well. Women were transported across the Sahara, the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean, traded more than the slave men. Enslaved people served in the houses of their masters or mistresses and were not employed to any significant extent for productive purpose. The enslaved were regarded as second-class members of their owner's family. In Somalia, the inhabiting Bantus are descended from Bantu groups that had settled in Southeast Africa after the initial expansion from Nigeria to Cameroon, and whose members were later captured and sold into the Arab slave trade. From 1800 to 1890, over 50,000 Bantu slaves are thought to have been sold from the slave market of Zanzibar to the Somali coast, where most of the slaves were from the ethnic groups of Tanzania, Mozambique, and Malawi. Collectively, these Bantu groups are known as Mushunguli, which is a term taken from Mzigula, the Zigua tribe's word for people. The word holds multiple implied meanings including worker, foreigner, and slave. Bantu adult and children slaves, referred to collectively as Jarir by their Somali masters, were purchased in the slave market exclusively to do undesirable work on plantation grounds. Potential buyers made a careful examination of the merchandise. They checked the state of health of a person who was often standing naked with wrists bound together. While in Cairo, for instance, transactions involving eunuchs and concubine slaves happened in private houses where the prices of these slaves varied according to the slave's quality. By the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire's control over the Balkan and Black Sea slave trades pushed Spain and Portugal to turn their attention to Africa. Initially, slaves were acquired from Arab traders via the trans-Saharan routes, but as Portuguese outposts were established along the West African coast, direct trade with Africa grew. This development fueled the rapid expansion of the Atlantic slave trade, which intensified following the discovery of the Americas in 1492. In the 15th century, Europeans began establishing a coastal slave trade, which expanded in the 16th century and continued through the 19th century. The majority of those enslaved and transported via the transatlantic slave trade were from Central and West Africa. They were typically sold to European slave traders by African traders, though some were captured directly in coastal raids. European traders would gather the enslaved in forts along the African coastal ports, such as Benguela, Elmina, and Boni in West Africa, before transporting them to the Americas. While some Portuguese and other Europeans conducted raids, most slaves were purchased from local African or African-European intermediaries. Despite their involvement, many European slave traders avoided participating in slave raids because of the high mortality rates due to diseases like malaria, dysentery, and yellow fever. These diseases plagued Europeans in Sub-Saharan Africa, leading to the region being known as the white man's grave. The first wave of European colonization, led by Spain and Portugal, primarily involved conquests and exploration in the Americas, but also included the establishment of trading posts in Africa, especially for the burgeoning slave trade. Spain and Portugal's reliance on enslaved labor in the New World became a highly profitable venture, fueling the expansion of their empires. In the Middle Ages, religion and not race was a determining factor for who was considered to be a legitimate target of slavery. While Christians did not enslave Christians, and Muslims did not enslave Muslims, both allowed the enslavement of people they regarded to be heretics or insufficiently correct in their religion, which allowed Catholic Christians to enslave Orthodox Christians, and Sunni Muslims to enslave Shia Muslims. Similarly, both Christians and Muslims approved of enslaving pagans who came to be a preferred and comparatively profitable target of the slave trade in the Middle Ages. Spain and Portugal were provided with non-Catholic slaves from Eastern Europe via the Balkan slave trade and the Black Sea slave trade. Religious zeal also played a large role in Spanish and Portuguese overseas activities. While the Pope wielded significant political influence, demonstrated by his ability to declare entire continents open for colonization by specific monarchs, the Church also sent missionaries to convert the indigenous peoples of other continents to the Catholic faith. Thus, in the year 1455, Papal Bull Romanus Pontifex granted the Portuguese all lands behind Cape Bojador and allowed them to reduce pagans and other enemies of Christ to perpetual slavery. Later in the year 1481, Papal Bull Aeterni Regis granted all lands south of the Canary Islands to Portugal. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull called Inter Caetera, which gave Spain and Portugal rights to claim and colonize all non-Christian lands in the Americas and enslave Native Americans and Africans. Inter Caetera also settled a dispute between Portugal and Spain over those lands. The declaration included a north-south divide 100 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands and gave the Spanish crown exclusive rights to travel and trade west of that line. In 1494, the Pope ushered in the Treaty of Tordesillas, granting Spain and Portugal two separate parts of the world. Due to this treaty, Portugal had the monopoly on acquiring the slaves from Africa. However, Spain, like Portugal, needed the labor force to pursue their personal economic gains, and this gave Portugal an increased revenue stream. African slaves were sold to the Spanish colonies through an internal reform known as the asiento, which gave the right by the Spanish crown for acquiring African slaves from the Portuguese traders. The curse of Ham was also used by European Christians as a justification to enslave Africans. In Portugal and Spain, people had been enslaved because of their religious identity, and race had not been a developed factor for enslaving people. Nonetheless, by the 15th century, Europeans used both race and religion as a justification to enslave Sub-Saharan Africans. The Treaty of Alcacuvas in 1479 provided traders the right to supply Spaniards with Africans. In the 15th century, the Iberian Peninsula saw a rise in the number of enslaved Africans from Senegal. As their population grew, Europeans introduced new terms that began to link slavery with skin color, such as the word Negro, meaning black. Spain and Portugal sought the utilization of foreign and indigenous peoples during post-colonial contact with the New World. The Portuguese and Spanish use of slavery in Latin America was seen as a lucrative business, which ultimately led to internal and external development in gaining economic influence at any cost. The economic pursuits of the Spanish and Portuguese empires ushered in the era of the Atlantic slave trade. As labor shortages worsened in Spanish and Portuguese colonies due to the devastating impact of European diseases and forced labor on the indigenous population, enslaved Africans were viewed primarily as a business solution. These slaves were forced into agricultural and mining work in regions under Spanish control, such as Mexico, Peru, and large parts of Central America, where slave labor became integral to mining operations. In the 15th century, Portugal shifted its attention to the latter economic endeavor. Their ships sailed from the borders of the Sahara Desert to the entirety of the West African coast, and slaves were only made available by certain conditions. The most notable condition was bartering items that the leaders wanted and were interested in. Items such as bread, coal, precious stones, and firearms were provided in exchange for slaves. Furthermore, local tribal leaders did not simply give up their own people for the aforementioned commodities, but rather through intertribal wars, debts, and civil crime offenders. In terms of the treatment of slaves, Portuguese external policies on the acquisition of slaves depict a malicious attempt to obtaining economic wealth. Nearly 3,600 slaves a year were traded by a single trader. This latter statement illuminates that traders tried to get as many slaves as they could in the shortest amount of time, Consequently, this led to the deaths of thousands of African peoples. Slaves were often branded with a mark upon their skin to identify either the ship they arrived on or the company that purchased them. In addition, the slaves were seen as a potentially economic utility. Therefore, they were often equated to cattle when moved about. Many African people died in large numbers in order to meet the demand for Spanish and Portuguese labor requirements. Both the Christian kingdoms of Spain and Portugal share a similar history in regards to the treatment of slaves in their colonies. As time progressed and new generations of slaves lived under imperial rule, Spanish and Portuguese internal reforms dealt with African slaves in areas such as the purchasing and selling of slaves, legal ownership, succession upon death of owner, the rights of slaves to buy their liberty, and penalties to those who ran away. There was a constant, strict social control amongst the slave population. Nevertheless, the goal was to create and sustain a labor force that would yield maximum economic output. The lucrative business the Portuguese sought on the West African coast ushered in an era in which human labor, at any cost, was used for the extraction of wealth. A common assumption by Africans who were unaware of the true purpose of the Atlantic slave trade was that the Europeans were cannibals who planned on cooking and eating their captives. This rumor was a common source of significant distress for enslaved Africans. Over 12 million people were forcibly taken onto European slave ships from African ports. Countless others perished on the journey to the coastal trading stations that supplied these ships. African victims of the transatlantic slave trade endured the loss of their communities, cultures, and lives, while African coastal traders who allied with Europeans gained power, prestige, and wealth by receiving goods and weapons in exchange for captives. European powers established treaties with African coastal leaders, enabling them to set up fortified trading posts in strategic areas. These strongholds, especially on the Gold Coast, influenced local demographics, trade routes, and settlement patterns. The Portuguese, Dutch, and British built forts, often called castles, to symbolize their power and wealth, using cannons to guard against rival European traders. However, while Europeans sought monopolies over the coastal slave trade, African leaders played competing European traders against each other, securing the best deals for their captives. The system of slave trade relied heavily on intermediaries, with captives held in factories or trading posts near the coast before being shipped to the New World. These factories became hubs of complex interactions between Europeans and Africans, creating new languages, cultures, and mixed communities. Pidgin languages developed from this exchange, blending African and European words to facilitate communication and trade. These evolving languages facilitated trade and communication, embodying the Creole identities of their speakers. Between 12 to 13 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic over 400 years, but the number taken was far higher due to the high death toll. Millions died during capture, in transit to the coast, or in the brutal seasoning camps in the Caribbean, where newly arrived slaves were subjected to harsh conditions to break them before being sold. The transatlantic slave trade became crucial to the economies of the South Atlantic and Caribbean regions, especially for sugarcane, coffee, tobacco, and cotton production. The Portuguese were the first to transport slaves to the Americas in the 16th century, with other European nations quickly following. During the early stages, enslaved Africans in English colonies were classified as indentured servants. But by the mid-17th century, slavery became a racial caste system, where African slaves and their children were deemed the legal property of their masters. The conditions during the transatlantic voyage were horrific, with many captives chained together in cramped, filthy spaces, suffering from diseases like dysentery, scurvy, and smallpox. Mortality rates were alarmingly high, and deaths only worsened the already unbearable conditions. The treatment of enslaved Africans during the Atlantic slave trade was brutal, as they were considered by slave traders to be mere cargo or goods, not human beings. Women with children and toddlers were less desirable for enslavement due to the space and maintenance they required. One infamous example is the Zong, a British slave ship that overcrowded its voyage in 1781. As malnutrition, disease, and bad weather slowed the journey and led to a water shortage, the crew chose to drown about 130 enslaved Africans to preserve resources and claim insurance for their deaths. Some enslaved individuals also chose to jump overboard in defiance. The Zong incident became a landmark in the abolitionist movement after the ship's owners were refused compensation by the insurance company, leading to a major court case. While enslaved individuals were kept alive with food and drink to preserve their value, resources were limited, and the crew was always prioritized. Punishments were frequent, and violence was used to force enslaved people into submission. In some horrific cases, such as a failed rebellion, a captain forced 2 enslaved men to eat the heart and liver of another who had been killed. Pregnant women who gave birth aboard these ships often saw their children killed, so the mothers could still be sold. To prevent resistance and illness, the crew forced the enslaved onto the deck for exercise, which often led to brutal beatings when they refused to comply. Enslaved Africans frequently resisted by refusing food or committing suicide, often by jumping overboard. Some ethnic groups like the crew became known for their defiance, with many committing suicide rather than enduring enslavement. Slaver crews attempted to prevent suicides by force-feeding the enslaved and using nets along the deck to stop them from jumping overboard, but resistance persisted. Captains also used extreme methods to deter escape attempts, such as exploiting the sharks that followed the ships. In one case, a captain lowered an enslaved woman into the water and pulled her out quickly, only for the crew to see that she had been partially devoured by sharks. Despite the harsh conditions, enslaved Africans often tried to escape or organize revolts. Rebellions were common, especially when ships were anchored off the African coast, but most were suppressed through extreme violence. Those who led revolts were killed and thrown overboard to the sharks as a warning to others. Ironically, insurance companies allowed slave traders to be compensated for the loss of enslaved Africans due to rebellion, disease, or punishment. The enslaved were treated as commodities with monetary value assigned to their lives, and laws enforced by European and American governments protected this dehumanizing system. Enslaved Africans vastly outnumbered the crew, so the traders used chains, manacles, guns, and severe discipline to maintain control. Routines were developed to manage the captives, including regular feedings and exercises on deck when weather permitted. However, most Africans remained shackled below deck, imprisoned in cramped conditions. Women and children had slightly more mobility, but they were vulnerable to abuse and rape by the crew. The squalid conditions aboard the ships also facilitated the spread of diseases like dysentery, killing many and leaving others in a weakened state. Despite efforts by captains and crew to control and suppress the enslaved, Africans found ways to communicate with each other. Through call and response songs and using the ship's structure as percussion, they developed a hidden system of communication that fostered solidarity and even aided in organizing revolts. This form of resistance provided a sense of identity and power in an otherwise oppressive and dehumanizing environment. Slave ships were specifically designed to prevent rebellion, but about 1 in 10 ships experienced some form of uprising. Though most revolts failed, the participants were punished severely, often by death, to discourage further resistance. While ship owners and captains profited greatly from the slave trade, the crew endured harsh conditions and low pay. Many sailors were forced to sleep on the open deck, as the space below was reserved for the enslaved. Crew mortality rates were high, with around 20% dying due to disease, punishment, or slave uprisings. For captains, high mortality rates among the crew were sometimes advantageous, as fewer sailors needed to be paid upon the ship's return. Those who survived often faced deceitful practices and were denied their wages. In total, contemporary historians estimate that between 9.4 and 12.6 million Africans reached the New World, but millions more perished before arrival. Despite the staggering human toll, the transatlantic slave trade remained a cornerstone of European colonial economic ambitions for centuries, powered by the exploitation of African lives. In the 18th century, the drive for profits in the Atlantic market economy led to innovations in ship design and the management of enslaved Africans and European crew members. Improvements in airflow on slave ships helped reduce the high mortality rates that plagued voyages in the 16th and 17th centuries. New ship designs also enabled faster travel and easier navigation along African coastal rivers, granting access to more inland slave trading posts. The enslaved were highly valuable in American markets, with mid-18th century auction prices ranging from $800 to $1,200 per person, equivalent to $32,000 to $48,000 today. To protect their human cargo ship, captains and investors sought technologies to increase the chances of survival during the Middle Passage. English ships were generally larger, while French ships were smaller. The ability to navigate rivers allowed smaller ships to reach more remote African ports, thus intensifying the impact of the slave trade on the continent. Over the 1700s, ship sizes increased slightly, but the number of enslaved individuals per ship remained constant, providing more space per person in hopes of improving survival rates. Ships were also equipped with temporary storage decks separated by latticed bulkheads to prevent mutinies. By the early 19th century, some ships even included ventilation ports to improve airflow and reduce the risk of disease, thereby minimizing financial losses. In addition to better ship design, knowledge of diseases and the inclusion of medicines aboard ships played a role in protecting cargo. The Dutch East India Company, followed by other nations, initially recognized the benefits of having surgeons on board, but found it too expensive. Instead, ships were stocked with a variety of medicines. While this was an improvement, the absence of medical personnel still contributed to high mortality rates during the 18th century. While about 1 million enslaved Africans died during the Middle Passage, the total death toll was even higher, including those who perished during raids on the march to the coast or shortly after arriving in the Americas. The Middle Passage was part of a longer, grueling journey. Survivors were often transported again after arriving in the Americas, enduring further hardship as they were moved to plantations, mines, and homes across the New World. Many enslaved Africans, weakened by their experience aboard the ships, died soon after arrival in places like Brazil and the Caribbean.